Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Arsenal Pass. Today we are joined by Brodie Spurlock to talk about, I don't know, the deck that was heard around the world, I guess, the Azalea deck that made it to the finals in the recent Realm Games tournament. It was actually an Azalea mirror. I believe you played against Levi. So, Brodie, let's just take it from the super top, right? Azalea. What made Azalea good enough to actually top a tournament, and then not only that, but win a tournament? Was it the cards and outsiders were so good that they brought up the class, or the heroes specifically, that seemed to be the worst in Flesh and Blood? Were they so far above curve that they were able to bring Azalea up? Or do you think that the Ranger cards that were printed in outsiders are the power level that Ranger cards should be to make a hero like this viable?
So I definitely think the cards are super strong. Like several of the cards from the new set. Premeditate, if you can get it to hit, is basically a 2-for-1. Codex of Frailty is basically a 2-for-1. Lace with Bloodrot, if it hits, is the equivalent of 5 damage, which is comparable to cards like Revel in Runeblood, or Swarming Limveil if you play them in Viscerai and get the extra rune chant. Those are also giving you 5. So we've seen cards like this in the past that are of similar power levels, but like you mentioned, Ranger hasn't really gotten any of those yet. So it definitely got a ton of new tools from this one set to kind of bring it up to par with the rest of the like tier 1 heroes.
Yeah, I guess it really is just about breaking that paradigm of, what we usually know to be 0 for 4 as sort of a baseline playable red card, depending on the conditions, but getting to 0 for 5 just makes that card so much more powerful that it can bring a hero like Azalea up into the competitive forefront and have it win a tournament. Let's talk about some of those outsider cards specifically. I have the deck sort of featured here on YouTube so people can see the deck list. What cards from Outsiders specifically? Can we dive into a few of them? I know you mentioned Lace with Blood Rot, but let's talk about the others from Outsiders that helped this deck sort of become what it is today.
Yeah, so the first one I guess is the Arrow Infecting Shot, which there are 5 in my list. 2 of them really just serve as blue cards that you very occasionally play, but the 3 reds are some of the strongest arrows, honestly, just in the game,
Mm-hmm.
because you, of course, attack for 5, and then Blood Rot on hit is, if they're spending a card to stop the Blood Rot, that's even better than the 2 damage. Like in a vacuum, a card is worth 3, so you got 3 out of it instead of 2. So basically, if you can pump it big enough or dominate it, to where your opponent just can't block it, or they're losing enough value from having to block instead of attack, the card is essentially just a 1 cost 7 attack arrow, which is massive. And then premeditate as well. It's a similar concept where, assuming you can dominate the on hit or just present so much damage that your opponent can't reasonably block it, it is giving +3 in addition to drawing you a card at the end of your turn. So it dealt 3 damage and replaced itself, that's like one of the strongest cards in the game. And then of course the recent Boogeyman Codex of Frailty is similarly creates a ponder, so it replaces itself, and then it lets you get the best attack out of your graveyard for the situation, and gives your opponent a frailty token, and then like also potentially messes with their hand by making them put an attack in arsenal and discard a card. So Codex is a 2-for-1 with oftentimes even more upside than that. So yeah, Premeditate and Codex, in my opinion, are the strongest 2 new
Mm-hmm.
tools.
Yeah, and it's funny because they both share this concept of getting a ponder token out of the card replacing itself. I wonder if, as design sort of continues in Flesh and Blood, if we will see this ponder token design sort of break the game. I know Codex of Frailty does a little bit more than that, but still, both cards do share that in common. I think to give any Ranger deck context, and specifically an Azalea deck, we got to talk about the equipment, right? We need to talk about the bow, and we need to talk about the headpiece. So tell me about the equipment slot you have and why you chose it, and how that dictates how the deck is built and how it's played.
For sure. So I've seen a lot of exploring recently with all different kinds of bows, which I'm actually curious to do more of myself. But I, at least in this list, I'm only playing Death Dealer because I think it's one of the strongest weapons in the game, um, purely from like a rate perspective. It's one resource to load an arrow and then also draw a card with Go Again. So you can look at that as 1 for 3 with Go Again because a face down card is worth 3. And so essentially, that is equal to the power of Rosetta Thorn, which is 1 for 4 without Go Again. But there's even less of a condition. So assuming that the cards you're working with in your deck all function well together and can actually be worth 3 in practice, Death Dealer, you could make an argument, is a better weapon than Rosetta Thorn. So it alone is incredibly powerful, and I think a big part of why this Azalea deck is so good. And then, like you mentioned, the headpiece, Skullbone Crosswrap, is also very key for what the deck is trying to do. Knowing the top card of your deck in Azalea um, can be worth a lot of like actual material value if you are dominating a big hit effect. Like obviously the most flashy and impactful one is Red in the Ledger. If you opt any of these arrows to the top that have a powerful on hit and dominate them, especially against like linear aggro decks, your opponent is oftentimes just left with like no choice but to take a ton of damage, pass their turn, and like burn cards in their hand, and you get lots of free value.
Hmm. And to sort of sum up the archetype of this Azalea deck, which is reflected in the equipment, it is a go tall, evasive, on hit relevant deck, right? So you're pumping up arrows, you're ideally getting dominate on them, and then you're inflicting your opponent with on hit effects that they can't deal with. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Either you're dominating them to get around blocks, or you're just making them so tall that your opponent can't reasonably block them or has to give you armor. Those are like the two ways to force the on hits through.
Hmm. What's like the general play pattern and sort of, if I'm picking up the deck for the first time, what am I trying to do? What's my sort of 10,000 foot game plan for this deck?
So I think versus a normal matchup where we're assuming your opponent's just a relatively linear deck trying to enact their own plan, Red in the Ledger is one of the key cards you're looking to use against like specifically Rune Blades and Ninjas and Fast X like that. So I think uh, the blue Knock the Death Whistle
Mhm.
is actually a very strong card, even though you have to spend a full card to go find red. Putting that on top and dominating it is so powerful that I would say like I'm oftentimes really happy to do that. So that's just like one thing is basically find red in the ledger as much as you can. Don't be afraid to burn a card to search for it. But also just in general, I think trying to activate Death Dealer every turn if you can, and arsenaling in a way that allows you to do that is one really good key tip going in because like we mentioned, Death Dealer is basically spending a resource for a card, which is a really good trade. And so ideally you don't want to be arsenaling arrows that don't have go again at the end of your turn, because that means the next turn, unless you manage to use Azalea ability, um, you have no chance to Death Dealer a new arrow in before you've spent your one action point. So I have actually found that I prefer to arsenal buffs or cards like Bolt and Shot,
Mhm.
or other things that can be given go again so that you can clear the arsenal out and Death Dealer again to take use of your weapon's value.
Makes sense. So, two Azaleas in this finals. I gotta ask you, what is the weakness of this deck? What are you hoping not to see, and what could potentially change in the meta to take it down?
I think some of the scariest matchups for Azalea are Dromai, especially if it's built uh, with the intention of targeting like the Azalea matchup, and then also just Fatigue Oldhim I'm still pretty scared of. I didn't have to face any of those in the tournament, and I've not tested against it a bunch, but I think it can be a really scary matchup um, because if you have enough like big D reacts, Azalea doesn't have a real weapon, of course. So over time you can just run her out of damage and fatigue her with a hammer.
Hmm. All right, let's look at the core deck list here, and maybe in some of the sideboard cards. But talk to me about some key interactions in this deck, stuff you're doing, kind of turn to turn, very consistently, and what ideal like play patterns look like throughout the game, and then maybe some sort of combos in terms of like finishers or reactive pieces that you have as ways to deal with decks that are maybe aggressing on you or stopping you from doing what you're doing.
Yeah, so a couple general like card combos or play lines. The first is Bolt and Shot with Rain Razors. If you can get Rain Razors to pump multiple arrows in your turn, then of course it becomes a very good card.
Hmm.
It's you get 0 for 4 or better out of it. It's above rate. So trying to line those two cards up with each other and ideally taking advantage of the reload text on Bolt and Shot.
Hmm.
You only use Death Dealer once, like we mentioned, and then beyond that, if you can get your Bolt and Shots to connect on a Rain Razor's turn, of course they're going to have greater power than their base, so you can reload another arrow. And like the dream is to be able to maybe start with a Bolt and Shot in your arsenal, fire it, play Rain Razors, and then you have another Bolt and Shot and another like one cost arrow in hand. So the idea is one of your Bolt and Shots will connect, and whichever one that is, the reload effect can be used to load an arrow, and then the final arrow in hand, whichever one like comes after a bolt and shot that did not connect, can be loaded with Death Dealer, and then you can get this like 3 arrow hand where you got 6 from your Rain Razors. So that's one thing to be looking to do, is just use those two cards together. And then also Codex of Frailty, which is like
Hmm.
basically the strongest card in the deck. I think just anytime you draw a Codex, it's so powerful that if at all possible, you should be trying to find a line where you can use it. And that often involves just blocking with your arrow cards and then playing all the buffs out of your hand so your hand is empty and you can play Codex and not discard to it. Um, because of course that's like you're basically just getting a whole extra card out of it. If you can play it with an empty hand, then you still get to load your arsenal back, but you have nothing to discard, so you don't have to. So yeah, just like anytime you have Codex in your 4 or 5 card hand, trying to find the most efficient line that makes use of the Codex and uh, empties your hand before it is like basically the best thing you can be doing in the Azalea deck.
Hmm. I have a small tangent follow up specifically around Rain Razors. So I want to talk about Rain Razors and talk about another card that I want to ask you about, which is Take Aim. So when you talked about Bolt and Shot, you mentioned the importance of the keyword reload. So I'm just wondering if you thought about the card Take Aim. And then my second question is on Rain Razors, how often do you find that you're affecting two arrows with that ability? And how I'm assuming that your ceiling is 3 arrows, right? Something with like a Snapdragon. So that's kind of the ideal scenario. Do you think that a 0 for 4 at instant speed that doesn't block is worth a sort of, mid tier 0 for 4, not going to happen all the time? And then your low roll seems pretty bad, right? You take a lot of risk with the 0 block, and then you're looking at maybe a 0 for 2 on some of these turns. Is Rain Razors a card that you felt good in, and do you think you'd keep it in the deck?
I think it's a super fair question. I do think it's one of the stronger cards because the list that I played runs 9 Bolton shots,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it reasonably likely that you'll be able to pair those two cards together a fair amount of the time. And also, Rain Razors is a yellow pitch, which actually comes up a lot for the Azalea deck, since we're running only 9 blues in most matchups, and then some yellows, and Tunic plays a big role in getting resources as well. But yeah, I think having a fair number of yellows is really nice. So you're definitely right that the no block can be scary, and sometimes Rain Razors is just like a way worse pump where you're using it for 2 instead of, all the other pumps are 3 and like some added value on top of that. But it can be nice also as just kind of using it as a combat trick per se.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't have the biggest arrow, if you're just going to shoot like a red in the ledger for 8 or even for 5, for example, and you just have a mystery card that you're going to arsenal, if your Briar opponent decides to give you like 1 card plus grasp to block your 5, and then you trick them with the Rain Razors, it can be really nice in that situation, though it doesn't come up as much. So yeah, overall, I do think that the card has weaknesses, but I would keep it in the deck. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely strong enough to play as a 3 of.
Did you consider Take Aim at all when building this list?
Take aim is the +3 that also lets you reload when you
Mm-hmm.
play it, right?
Yes.
I think it's definitely like a solid card and worth considering, but I think with the upgrades from Outsiders, all the buffs we have access to are just like so strong that I think it ends up just getting pushed out, and there's like all the buffs have such relevant on hits that I think it's hard to find space for.
Mhm. Talk to me a little bit, at least from a high level, about the ratios, the number of blues, the number of yellows, and the number of reds. And do you think that these numbers could be tweaked at all in terms of, maybe adding more power to the deck by cutting down on blues or cutting down on yellows? Or do you think that you found sort of a solid balance of blue pitch, yellow pitch, and red pitch?
Yeah, so the whole core of my deck is taken from Levi Roush.
Hmm.
Shout out to him. He was my finals opponent at the Brawl, and he's kind of like the Azalea master. He's been on this deck for a really long time, and so I just copied his main deck and like his ratios and everything. And so I have found them to work quite well when playing the deck. It's felt pretty smooth and like I have access to the number of resources I need most of the time. Most of the cards in the deck cost 0. There are several one-cost arrows. But yeah, like from my experience playing it so far, I felt like the ratios are pretty solid, but I would encourage people to tweak them up and down a little bit and continue to try new things. But yeah, I mean, I would say I've felt pretty solid with the 9 blues and I believe it's 12 yellows.
Yeah, and I have to ask you a question from my personal interest. Is both you and Michael Hamilton are on the Wolfpack Flesh and Blood team that does test together and is looking at Pro Tour Baltimore. Michael Hamilton also ended up in the top 8 of this tournament. Ended up on Icelander. You on Azalea. Can you talk to me? Does Michael Hamilton not believe in Azalea, or is it maybe more of a pet deck of Brodie Spurlock? And do you think Azalea is competent and is powerful enough to maybe show up as a top tier deck in the upcoming Pro Tour Baltimore?
I think it's funny that you asked this question because I was actually also going to play Icelander along with him up until Friday morning, and I just decided that I wanted to try the new thing and like play what I thought maybe was going to be like a crazy strong deck, but I didn't have enough testing to tell, so I last minute switched to Azalea. But to answer your questions, I definitely don't think that Michael Hamilton uh thinks Azalea is bad or anything. I think he just felt more comfortable on Icelander for this event and wanted to stick with that. And do I think that Azalea could be a really strong deck at Pro Tour? Yes, I actually really like where Azalea's at because I think she's one of the strongest linear decks in the format.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that there's counterplay to her, and people will come prepared, so she won't just totally dominate the field.
Yep, for sure. Let's move on to the sideboard here because the sideboard always tells, it tells a big story. We've got 3 battering bolts, 2 fatigue shots, 3 Widowmakers, which I'm particularly interested in, 3 tar pit trap, and 2 infecting shot. Let's just go across the line, Brodie. Explain to me these sideboard slots and what they come in for and what their purpose is.
Yeah, so starting with the 2 blue infecting shot, that's literally just there to be able to sideboard into a couple more blues, mostly for Icelander. I was also bringing them in versus Lexi because some Lexi builds will give you frostbites and the like, but literally just blue cards. And then the battering bolts are only there as poppers versus Dromai. I think there might be niche cases where you play them versus other heroes who play a lot of reactions or something, but mostly they're just there as 6 power arrows. And then Tar Pit Trap, I have not tested much at all, but in one game in the Brawl this weekend, it really overperformed, and I would say it like won me the game. And it's mostly there as like a tech card for any heroes that often have both Go Again and on hits, since
Mm-hmm.
those are like the 2 conditions on the trap. It helped me a lot in a game versus Lexi, where they were attacking with an endless arrow, and I tar pit trapped it, and basically they had a rain razors, they played another rain razor, so I was definitely going to take the hit from this arrow, except that I had the trap and shut down their whole big combo turn. But yeah, it's there for like I'm still unsure if I want to play the full 3 versus Lexi. I want to test more. The fear is that if they give you frostbites, it becomes a lot more awkward.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe hero like ninjas, um, stuff like that. Uh, I think there's more exploration to be done with that card, but I have liked it so far. And then finally, oh, 2 more things. The 2 fatigue shots, those are there kind of just basically for what you'd expect against heroes with big attacks. Oldhim, Icelander, things where your arrows like Red in the Ledger aren't as impactful. Like even though Red is the strongest card in the deck versus fast aggro decks, versus Oldhim, it's hardly ever going to do anything. So you just have this alternative arrow that has a relevant on hit for the kinds of big turns that they're going to do, since their big turns are one massive attack instead of playing a lot of cards. And then, yeah, finally the Widowmakers. I have not really tested these at all. I played one game with them before the event, and I never had to sideboard them in during the event.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that they're just there for Oldhim because of the line of text that says you can't play defense reactions. The +3 thing isn't actually real because they can just block with their Crown of Seeds or something, and like you're never gonna get the +3, um, at least against Oldhim. But it's just so that if you're getting fatigued and they've got a lot of like they've got a heavy D-react list, that hopefully you can shoot a big arrow and trap them with D-reacts in hand and leak some damage through.
Yeah, that does make sense. Okay, sort of the always the sort of closing question on these deck taxes. Now that you've played the deck and coming off the back of the tournament, are there any cards that you would change moving forward?
Um, Definitely, I think the sideboard has some more room to be worked on. Like I said, I liked Tar Pit Trap so far, but I could definitely see cutting it for something else. I know a lot of Azaleas are playing Boulder Trap. I think there's a lot of room to add more tech cards in that space. I think the main deck is pretty solid. Um, I am undecided on how I feel about E-Strike. I feel like it underperformed over the weekend, but of course it's one of the more consistent cards, and it's not really there to be a flashy, impressive attack. It's just to like fix your more awkward situations. So it's quite possible that 3 is correct, but I want to tweak that, or just like
Mhm.
test it more and maybe cut down on those in the future since the deck is so powerful now. I think maybe your hands tend to be good enough that you don't need a fixer. Very unsure about that, but those are the things I might consider changing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and doing this deck tech. I'm super excited to see where Azalea goes from here, and especially what's going to happen in Pro Tour Baltimore. I think off the back of the recent results of these tournaments, it looks kind of like anybody's metagame as we head into Baltimore. We do have one more big tournament that will give us a lot of leading indicators for information to use to sort of metagame what could potentially show up in Classic Constructed. Still quite an enigma at this point. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Brodie. Brodie is going to write a sideboard guide and an additional set of tips and tricks, sort of matchup by matchup, that's going to go up on the Arsenal Pass Patreon if you're looking for more stuff to help you pick up the deck and be successful. Deck list is in the description below, as always. And yeah, thanks again, Brodie.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.